In 1937, 5 prominent Polk County citizens from 5 communities established the Polk County Historical Society. The express purpose was to collect and preserve the history and traditions of the county and to cooperate with the State Historical Society in the preservation of such history. A historical museum display room was set up in the Polk County Center building, Balsam Lake, to house the collected artifacts. Willis Erickson was appointed curator in 1960. The Society had the Lanesdale School moved to Balsam Lake in 1963 for a rural life museum. The 1899 courthouse became the Polk County Museum on July 4, 1976, under the direction of the Society, which continues to the present day.
I want to welcome you to the Polk County Museum today, and we're in the fine arts and glassware dish display area. And we have in this display a group of old clocks. Some of them are mantel clocks and others hung on the wall. We even have one of the last 75 years from Germany, a cuckoo clock. Some of these clocks are well over 100 years old, and 3 of the 5 of them here run through the generosity of one of our technicians, Roy Gables. But we have a number of these here that an old steeple type of clock because it resembled a church steeple. That's why it was named that. These are all American made excepting for this one cuckoo clock that was made in Germany. And there's different kinds. We've got one here that's especially good. It's similar to one that we have out at another exhibit in another place in the county, and that is, this one is similar to the one that came through the Chicago fire and was survived because it was hidden in a trunk in Chicago during that fire. It was brought to Clayton, and right now that's in the Clayton library exhibit. But that's similar to this steeple clock that we have on the right-hand side. We do have quite a number of different pieces of china here. Those, many of them imported from foreign countries. And it's interesting that in the 1890s, the U.S. government made it compulsory for those that were exporting Chinaware to the United States to put down what country it was coming from. In this particular group we got from Bavaria, a section of Germany, including this plate. It's kind of interesting how they have fruit displays on the outside and also on the inside of the coffee cup. This happens to be a set of 4. There are others through here that also show up some interesting different designs. Down here we've got one that is RS German, and this too has a nice rosebud on the inside along with a rose flower on the outside. This is just a recent acquisition of the museum. And of course from other parts of Germany we have this milk pitcher or lemonade, whatever it happened to be. And then we have a number of other things here that kind of show up. One of the outstanding plates we have in the museum is this one that was hand painted by an artist, and that too is imported from Germany. We have here a number of different pattern glasses that were quite popular back in the early part of the 1900s, and we have some cut glass up in here that was quite popular about from 1885 or so to about 1910. Then it got so labor intense that they went to the pattern type of glass because it was cheaper to make and many more people could afford to buy it. So we have some of both, and we have mostly patterned glass of many different patterns here. People who are interested in glassware will identify each pattern and what company made it over a period of the last century and a quarter. Etched glass too, a combination of etched and cut. The etched is where it's dulled with acid. Among the many things in this cabinet, we've got a hurricane lamp, and the reason they kind of called it that back in the 1880s and 90s was because it would resist a wind or a breeze without blowing out. And this one is a red satin glass. Both the shade and the base are that, and that's quite an unusual piece because many of them were hand painted with white on white or clear porcelain. So this one is, along with some of the other smaller items that are here, make an interesting combination display of many things from hat pins to combs that were used in the ladies' hair 100 years ago. Here's a collection of pottery. There are three major manufacturers of this, Roseville and Weller and McCoy and some of the other American potters made pottery, and most of these patterns were sold in stores in this county, only given away as gifts, probably for Christmas or a special birthday or maybe a wedding present in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and on up. The Red Wing pottery, of course, shows one of the very popular ones that many people bought 50 years ago, the one with the fawn in the middle of a flower display area. Here we've got quite a number of different glassware displays, including carnival glass and some of the various colors of glass. But the two lamps, I just want to show your attention. This first hanging lamp has a real interesting history to it. It was in the Woodrow Wilson family over in Michigan, and a school teacher that whose home was here in Polk County was able to buy it when they had to raise some money to restore the home, or his home there in Michigan. So she bought this hanging lamp, and so it was used in his home before World War I, when he became president, of course, later on. In the distance is one of the lamps that was used too in the 1920s or so, much later than this hanging lamp. And of course it doesn't have quite as famous a brand name as some of the others, but with that special metal lacing on it to give it some color and contrast, along with the different colored glass and the shade. Used quite a bit and were very popular back in the 1920s. And then we've got, of course, all kinds of colored glass. People sometimes can spend an hour in this general exhibit area just looking this over. We have on this display a number of different cups and other things of special interest. We have a picture in 6 glasses that are souvenir of St. Croix Falls here in this county, which is kind of an unusual combination as a souvenir of that city back about 90 years ago. One of the things we've got here are several mustache cups that were very popular, some real fancy ones, and we've got a whole collection of those, as well as we have a few children's cups that show different children's stories through this area here. Down the bottom we've got a set of dishes that was bought in 1883, and when we got it as an acquisition for the museum, the bill of sale was still there from 1883. It cost a little over $13 for a set of 12 placings, including 2 sets of cups. And this is what's left of the set right now. We have here a musical instrument called a melodeon. There's one similar to this in Mount Vernon that was used by the George Washington family, but this one was brought up the St. Croix River, one of the first musical instruments that came to this county way back in the 1850s. Above it is a painting of the Dells of the St. Croix done by an artist of 1883, and it looks pretty good. The Dells of the St. Croix look the same today as at this time when this was painted in 1883 by a minister that lived in St. Croix Falls. Welcome to the Native American display that has been cared for by the Native Americans of this area. Until recently, because of 2 deaths, we are a little short-handed on working. We do have an archaeologist that helps us here too. But we have here a wigwam that was made exactly according to a pattern that was found on a birch bark diagram by a man who was Indian chief here about 150 years ago. This is done, and a family of 4 children and 2 adults lived in this wigwam. Now they didn't have a window here. We put that in so people could see what the inside looked like a little easier. But they did have a doorway and an opening in the center for the smoke to go out from the bonfire that was in the middle of the room. All a family of 6 lived in here in the wintertime, I'm not quite sure. But the door that they had was deer skin, or skin of one of the animals, whatever they could do. And they would insulate the outside walls with additional hides from animals that they got, so it wouldn't be quite so cold in there in the wintertime, because there were temperatures that would drop quite low, 20, 30, and even 40 below zero sometimes during the wintertime. Now this is a duplicate of the one that was out here a mile west of town, east of town, the home of the Mosey family. And Chief Archie Mosey, who we'll talk about here a little more, made this, and and he had to get the bark from a spring bark from a white ash tree to do it according to specifications. We have here the headdress that Chief Archibald Mosey wore until about 12 years ago, and then a new one was made for him out of eagle feathers. But that is kind of an interesting one. We do have quite a collection of Indian moccasins, all done with beadwork, and there is quite a difference and variety of beadwork. The beads were made to kind of resemble flowers, and the flowers had a symbol resembling families of the Indians. So it's kind of interesting. Anyway, we do have a ceremonial beadwork here that is quite unique. It was traded off for some groceries here about the turn of the century here in Balsam Lake. And then we have a number of peace pipes, ceremonial pipes, and these are made out of the stone that's found near Rice Lake here in this part of the state of Wisconsin, and the pipestone quarry over in western Minnesota. And the reason they use this kind of stone because it was soft when it first was quarried, so you could carve it out with a knife and make designs if you want on it. We have a number of them here, including the one that was used by the Indian tribes officially in their ceremonies. We have here a stone axe that was used and found right here in Polk County. It's grooved on two sides at the top or the bottom, and it was tied to a handle, of course, with some either wood sinews or something from the hide of animals. And then we have two spear points. This one is chiseled out of stone, and this one is out of copper. And these are all both found in this area and were used by the Woods Indians as they went out hunting. And there are different sizes. We have quite an assortment of arrow points, bird points, spear points, drills, and hide scrapers. And for those of you interested in Native American artifacts, you might want to visit the museum sometime to see these. We're looking at a birch bark canoe that was salvaged from Lake Waupagasset, west of Avery, about 120 years ago, and stored in a barn for many years. The reason it wasn't used anymore is because somebody had chopped a hole out of the end of it. And it's just the way it was found. It would need quite a bit of repair to be able to be floating again in the lake, but it is put together with pine pitch, birch bark, and various kinds of the inner bark of different trees that grew and produced a tough fiber to sew the birch bark canoe together. Welcome to the Polk County Village. The materials for these buildings, these front buildings that were put up in this room, came from buildings that were being torn down and razed in different areas of the county. The one we're looking at right now was the original old First Bank of Centuria, and when that was torn down for a brick building way back, they saved the material, and fortunately we were able to get it for the museum. We have different buildings with different things in them here, and we're going to go just around and show some of the things as you go walk through the old village. The sidewalks are wood, as they were until about 1910, 1920, in most all the villages and cities of this part of the country. We're here in a kind of a combination of three rooms. Over on this side we do have somewhat of a doctor's office with several of the labels for different communicable diseases that were concerned when they would isolate certain families for a while they were sick with the smallpox or measles or something else. Over in this area we've got a barber shop, and we did put a hair curler in that some of the ladies over middle-aged would remember having been used for their permanence way back in the 1930s and 20s. The barber chair was one that was left just the way it was used once, and it was in a barber shop in about 1870, so it's quite old. We do have some shaving mugs and other things there, and this part of the museum is being redone this summer. Welcome to the general store. The general store had almost everything in it, including a small area that was a post office. And in it you could buy clothes, groceries, you could buy tools and other things that you needed because it was the only store in the community. If you wanted to come there, you would go up to the counter and the person who was in charge of the store would get the materials for you. Sometimes you had to go to a high shelf to pick them up and bring them down and set them on the counter, and then they would add them up with a old-fashioned cash register, or even before that time they probably just added them up one piece at a time on a piece of paper. And then the bill, of course, was you paid for it in cash. There were no credit cards in those days, so you paid for it in cash. Sometimes people would have to charge some of the materials and pay for them at the end of the month when they had money to do it. But in a general store you had everything from washing supplies to at least some of the clothing and all kinds of different tools and things that they would use in their home. All right, and now we're looking at the front of this counter in this store, and of course they would sell almost everything in bulk. You could buy some dried corn, dried beans, even crackers of different kinds, and of course they would be sold by the pound, and you'd find that it was kind of interesting to buy a pound of those probably for 5, 6, 7 cents a piece. They didn't have plastic bags in those days, but they did have later on paper bags, so they could put them in something so you could take them home with you. One of the biggest concerns that they had in those days was preserving things to keep them from spoiling. And of course there was always the danger of insects getting into flour and other things that they would buy, so they didn't buy too much at a time. Welcome to the military exhibit here. We do have exhibits for beginning with the Revolutionary War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and the Civil War is a fairly good exhibit that we've got here. And then we go on up to the Korean and the Vietnam Wars. And our military exhibits show quite a number of things that were quite popular during that time in our history. We do have quite a number of things that are of interest to people. People will spend probably close to an hour just visiting the military exhibits here. We have quite a few artifacts from the wars, and among them we have a flag that was on Hermann Göring's car back in 1939. It was taken by two 11-year-old boys and eventually ended up in the Polk County Museum. 1939, Hermann Göring's motor coach flag. And Hermann Göring was one of the officers that Adolf Hitler had in World War II. Okay, we've got in every one of the exhibits quite a number of things. Besides uniforms, we've got equipment. And I thought one of the things that's interesting about World War I, the soldiers used leggings because they had tight laced leggings that went up their calves of their legs rather than having loose trousers as they had in World War II. And we show some of that here along with the helmets that they wore and some of the other artifacts, including some of the officers' equipment of World War I. We do have a real good exhibit of World War II showing lots of things, including the insulated flight jackets and boots and pants that the pilots had to use in World War II because they didn't have any heaters in many of those fighter planes. So it is important. In fact, we even have a suit of electrical operated heated underwear. And I asked the officer that wore that, he said it didn't work very good. The wires broke and he was cold in part of his body even when he was in flight in World War II. We do have quite a number of things from the Civil War, and one of them is the flag that was sewn by some ladies in St. Croix Falls and sent with their men to the battlefield. It does have 2 holes that were made by cannonballs, and it's now preserved in an acid-proof bag. But it was a big flag used in battle and returned to the place where it was made back 140 years ago. Some of the uniforms and rifles that were used, some of the first aid kits and other things, even the canteen, are part of the collection of the Civil War. Logging was a very important part of the early history of Polk County because there were large white pine forests here too, and there were enough rivers to send it on down, logs on down to be sawn up for lumber, which was the case that most of them, where they went, was to Stillwater and further south. In fact, many of the logs that were floated down the St. Croix River also went as far as St. Louis to build the early homes there in about 1870, 1880, and 1890. The logging camps were simple, and the equipment they had in them was real simple too. We have an exhibit of even a checker game that they made out of a board that they had sewed up and used it because there wasn't any way to buy much of anything. And of course we have a reasonably good collection of the marking axes that would mark who had the logs when they were sent down the river. Because by the time they got to Stillwater and other places along the river, they all looked pretty much alike, excepting for the label that was on the end of the log. And of course they used all kinds of horse-drawn equipment. We do have a sled that was used in some of the later logging camps. In fact, there were a few camps that even had railroads that went into them to pick up some of the logs. But most of them, the logs were hauled out by teams of horses or teams of oxen, and depending upon how early it was. And of course the logs were big, 3, 4, 5 feet in diameter. And then of course after the white pine was gone, they began to harvest some of the other hardwoods, like the oak and the maple, some of the other things. And of course, with good management of forests, we can still harvest today. And that's being done every year here in Polk County, but it's a very small amount of the total work that's being done in the county today. We have here a cooking kettle that was used in the logging camp. It has a wooden handle. It's made out of copper, and it was used to cook oatmeal and potatoes or whatever else they would cook for the loggers when they came in for their evening meal, and probably even their noon lunch. The lantern that we see there was used in the logging camp to help light, because there was no electricity in those days anywhere nearby. So they used oil kerosene lamps to light the logging camp after dark. And in the wintertime, when they were doing most of their logging, it would get quite dark by 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Then of course they would be hungry and eat. And one of the significant things is that to get their source of vitamin C, the kind of thing we talk about when we have orange juice and other juices, especially citrus juices, is that they cooked up the wild cranberry bush fruit, which is a red fruit, tastes like cranberries, but it comes from a different bush, and that would stay on all winter, so they could harvest it all winter long, and the birds didn't bother until spring. So they would have a source of vitamin C for the logging camps, and this was quite important for Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan, to keep the loggers healthy during the winter months when they didn't get any vitamin C any other way. We have surveying tools here. We have 3 of them. The newest one is on a tripod, and that was used to mark the railroads that were being built through Polk County area, the Sioux Line and the Chicago Northwestern. And then the older 2 are here that were used to survey the land back in the 1850s and 60s and 70s up until about 1890, when they were completed the surveying of land. These instruments were used to mark the townships, the sections, and the quarter sections. Go through the landing here in the stairway between the first and second floor. We just want to show you some of the things that might be of interest to you. We do have a well pulley that was used to pull water or pails up from the well before they had pumps and all the electrical things we have today. In the center of that one exhibit, we've got a tintype, and that was the first photography that was used. It was put on a piece of metal rather than on film, because they didn't have film in those days. They didn't have a sensitive material. They put on a metal plate, and that was used about during the 1850s and 40s. That was the first pictures that were made when they used the tintype. And we got some old recipe books and other things that are of interest to most people as they just walk through the landing, going on upstairs to see some of the interesting things there, including the parlor and the bedroom and the ethnic displays and other things that you'll find interesting there too. Welcome to the Victorian bedroom. We have here a a bed, black walnut one, that was probably made about Civil War time, about in the 1850s, 1860s, brought up the St. Croix River from the Mississippi River and brought to St. Croix Falls. But anyway, on the bed we've got a special bedspread that I think is quite unique. The lady that made this made it out of grocery string, and it weighs about 7-8 pounds when you, and all the design work that she did with it, it's quite an interesting piece of artwork that she did. Of course, we do have a quilt at the bottom of it and some pillows, but on the edge of the bed we also have a trundle bed that a small child could sleep in, and then they'd fold it down and roll it under the bed out of the way for the daytime. We have, of course, a set of Victorian furniture here, several pieces that are kind of interesting, and you'll enjoy visiting the bedroom as you go through the second floor of the museum. Welcome to the Victorian parlor. These were the special front rooms that they had in some of the farm homes and in the village and cities. They'd only use them when company came. And of course, here we've got an interesting hanging lamp that's one of a kind, very unusual to have a blue glass shade. And among other things that we've got here is an interesting old parlor organ. Oftentimes they'd get together as a group of visitors and family and sing. And of course the pianos came in later in time, but the old parlor organ was one that was used earlier. And we have, of course, again, Gone with the Wind lamp and other things here that were part of that special room that they used probably only occasionally, because for one thing they didn't even have sufficient heating systems in the homes to heat it during the winter, excepting with a special stove that would be located in the room. And people would have to sit very cautiously as they were visiting with each other in those days of the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. All right, we do have a small display of old radios from the 1920s, 1910s on up to the present time, and we do have a few record players of different kinds in the museum too that are of interest. We do have a couple old television sets too that some people might be interested in. We do have a collection of two looms, one of them to make rugs and the other to weave cloth. And from time to time we get people that are here and are working on these. We do have a third loom that made belts, a small one, and it's kind of interesting when these crafts are carried on, and the third loom will be assembled and will be in use sometime in the next 2-3 years. Okay, we have a couch here along with some other furniture in this display showing, and this is probably the earliest piece of furniture that came up the St. Croix River back in the 1850s, and it has been reupholstered once, but it still is quite a significant, along with the picture above it and some brick-back shelves and things like that that were part of the parlor and the living room of a long time ago. The church exhibit has a number of artifacts from the churches in the area. We do have well over 100 churches in Polk County, and among them this old organ was used in St. Mary's Church in McKinley. We do have other things that are significant here, like some of the old pews and some of the other altar artifacts and different things from all the different churches of the county. And this one is being redone now again. Will be under construction beginning early this fall. When the settlers came to this country from particularly Europe, they were very poor. They didn't have much of any belongings. They couldn't take them with them because they couldn't haul them in their boats that they came across in, and they probably couldn't afford to. So they had a pretty modest home when they finally built a log cabin in the land in which they probably was deeded to them as a homestead. And if they stayed long enough, they would have it as permanent property. And the exhibit we have here shows a little bit of what a homestead cabin, the inside of it might have looked like back about 1870, 1860 in the northern part of Polk County. We have here an exhibit of a love seat. Only 2 people could sit on it anyway, and it was used again in the parlors particularly, but we have it here showing a number of different things, the clothes that they may have worn at that time, and some of the significant things that were part of their family living. Love seats were only used occasionally. This one that's shown here still has as part of its horsehair upholstery on it that was there in the 1860s when it was made. We have here on exhibit some of the things that the men wore back about 100 years ago, and some of them 60, 80 years ago. The fur coats date back from the early part of the century and the last part of the early part of the 19th century and the last part of the 1800s. This one is a bearskin and coonskin coats. They were warm because they were using sleighs and cutters and transportation that didn't have any heater in them. So it was kind of important that they wore warm clothes in the wintertime. And of course the suits, a wedding suit worn by a man who ran for President of the United States once. And then we have hats and other things that were used for travel and also for dress. Part of what the men might have had the last 150 years. 1920s, an interesting time when the ladies began to wear clothes that they hadn't worn before because they were shorter skirts and more stylish, at least according to them at that time. And this shows an old photograph, an old candlestick telephone that might have been used during that time, along with a portable sewing machine and the dresses of different kinds. And we even have an old calendar from one of the communities of our county dating about 1927. Some of the clothes that they wore at that time and different things that they had. People were able to afford a little more during the 1920s. It was a prosperous time, so they also dressed accordingly. And they too, the ladies too, wore fur coats. And of course they had fur around their coat collars and other places too. Okay, this was a sewing machine that was used in the Roaring Twenties. Bought in about 1926. Still in use until this last year. It still would work for somebody that wanted to pedal push it. Never was electrified. We do have a rather extensive button collection. Buttons of all kinds made out of metal, abalone from the different shells, and then later on plastics and wood and all kinds of different things. But we do have quite a button collection. Some of you that are collecting buttons might be interested in taking a slow walk by the button collection that we have in the museum. Welcome to the ethnic display. We do have quite a number of different displays of people that came across, most of them from Europe, to settle here in Polk County. And this one is a Norwegian display. The Norwegians came in a little bit later than the Germans, the English, the Scottish, and the Irish. But it is one of our interesting displays because they had more time to handcraft their suitcases, their trunks, and other things, as well as a number of the artifacts that they brought with them. Many of the Norwegians wore wooden shoes at that time. Some people think it was only the people from Holland that did, but the Norwegians did too, because they were able to make shoes out of wood easier than probably out of leather, and they probably were less costly. The spinning wheel, another trunk we have there, some of the different artifacts that were brought across, hand-carved spoons and scoops and other things, make it an interesting display. One of the 8 ethnic displays that we have here. French fur traders, but they didn't settle very long. They moved on to other places. The English, the Scottish, and the Irish were some of the earliest settlers. They came up and were part of the trade with the American Indians too. And some of the artifacts that they brought along are shown here. And of course many of them came through to this country up until through the Irish potato famine of about 100 years ago. We have an English tea set that was very important for them to bring with them, along with even some tools and some different points of information that were quite interesting with those from the British Isles. Welcome to this part of the ethnic display. This is the Swedish display. The Swedes came in right after the Germans probably did, early, and they came up the St. Croix River, and of course they were part of the big Swedish settlement that went over into Minnesota. Some of them came to Wisconsin instead. And the history of their communities is 135, 40 years old. settling in the central part of Polk County, the northern part of Polk County, and some in the southeastern corner of Polk County. The Swedes brought with them, of course, every family almost brought with them a spinning wheel because they weren't able to buy them here, along with other things that they thought they needed, besides some cloth and maybe some ornaments. And of course they continued to come here until about 1910. The Germans settled the particularly parts of the county, and they usually tried to pick out the best farming land that they could. And they were there a little before the Scandinavians, so they got the probably the nice flat farming land of Polk County, and Polk County has some of that here and there all over in almost every township, and that was settled pretty much by the German families because they wanted that. Now, you see, the people that came from Norway and Sweden weren't concerned about that because the land they came from was hilly and they were able to farm it there too, so they didn't worry too much about the nice flat level deeper soil land that was on the flat prairies. We don't have a lot of prairies in the county, but we do have a few. So the German people were able to settle many of those early, and of course they brought with them things too, and they learned from the Norwegians and Swedes how to build a log cabin because they didn't have those, and they worked together pretty good. They spoke their own languages. Some of them intermarried, but it was a kind of an interesting time of the early settlements in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. The Danes came in from Denmark about the same time that the biggest Swedish settlement was already over with, so they too couldn't select the largest or the better farmlands. They, for the most part, were happy to get 40 acres of land to settle because they had small farms in Denmark. We have I think it's the third largest settlement immigrants of Danes in Wisconsin, here in Polk County. And most of them settled in Luck, Cushing, Milltown, and the area north of Balsam Lake, with a few of them going into other parts, but most of them there. And they were very good farmers. They were used to farming high quality dairy farms and livestock farmers. So they were, and of course they helped to organize several of the cooperatives. The oldest cooperative creamery in the state of Wisconsin was organized here in this county by a group of Danish immigrants. And we have on display in the display here the bust of the lady that was one of the leaders in that early cooperative movement among the Danes in this county. The spinning wheel, of course, brought across by the Duholm family of Polk County here, way back in the early days of the 1860s when they came across from Denmark. And one of the interesting things is this wool carding device that would fasten on the wall or on top of the table, and they could card wool with it. It's pegged together with wooden pegs, and a real simple thing, but a very good device because they would do this to card the wool before they would spin it. We were beginning a French display. We had a number of people that came by Quebec, Canada, down here to settle, and they settled the central part of the county back in the early days, and there was quite a group of them. And they've now collected some history on their families, and we started at least with a chair that came from France, and of course they too had fur coats. But one of the things that's most interesting is they were people that had a lot of fine china, but the settlers didn't have too much of it left when we started the museum, but they're gradually collecting a little more of it now. We do have a wreath that was made out of human hair in the center up here, and that's kind of an interesting thing. We don't know exactly the background of that, but it's kind of neat how they took, when they would cut the hair off of the ladies, and of course it was probably 2 feet long, they would weave it together and make a thread out of it, and then weave it together and make a special wreath. It was used by Ulysses Grant. Ulysses Grant became President of the United States after Abraham Lincoln, and it was in his home in Galena, Illinois, a part of a set of 8 chairs that were in that home, and we happen to have one of them. So we do have 2 items from presidents of the United States. It's kind of unique in this museum. This is the Howe sewing machine. This preceded the Singer sewing machine. In fact, Mr. Singer bought out Howe, who invented the sewing machine. And we do have this one. It's in its condition that it was in when it was given to the museum. Nothing has been done to it. It is almost in working order with a little cleaning up. It probably will be, and we'll try and do that. The Howe sewing machine, the first sewing machine made. The one-room country school was a very important part of every community. And of course then there were the smaller schools that were probably multi-classroom in our villages and cities. But among the early days of the school, which started almost as soon as the county was settled at all, they began school. And this is one of the unique things of the early settlers. They had schools within a year of their settlement in all the communities where they settled. And of course some of the old things, the old school clock, the dinner pails, the ink pens, the bells that the teacher would use to call the class together, and the slates that were used before they had paper to write on. This is one of the old originals, and a number of other things that were part of the school activities of that long ago. Then one of the things I think is unique is the fact that they didn't have running water in those schools either, and had to have a drinking fountain, so they would carry the water in a pail to the school and put it in that kind of a cooler, and the kids could drink water then. And of course the water was probably just as sanitary then as it is today. If the dust wasn't blowing too hard in the road as they were carrying the pail to the school. Very few schools had wells of their own, so they would carry it from a neighbor's house. And then we have in this exhibit quite a number of things that are unique. Some of the different pieces of educational equipment. We also have a one-room school that's completely equipped as it was way back in the 1890s. And the school activities have been going on there for the last 3 weeks. And the students that came there to that school these last weeks are dressed like they would have been about 1900. We do have in here quite a number of other things. We have the exhibits of each of the towns of the county, and the 2 cities, St. Croix Falls and Amory, and all the villages are located in a special exhibit here in the different cases in this room. So you'll find it quite interesting, and particularly if you have some interest in any one of the villages or the cities of Polk County. Here we've got what an old school teacher would have looked like. A mannequin that is kind of dressed like a school teacher would have looked. Some of the rules and punishments were quite common in those days. And of course this school teacher would have started to teach school when she was probably about equivalent of 17 or 18 years old. They would go to teachers training. We had a teachers college in the county here where the teachers were trained for 2 years before they went out to teach. And of course the early wages for teachers wasn't very much money. They used to room with one of the people in the district and probably walk to school, start a fire and heat up the building so that the ink and other things would be thawed out by the time, this is during the winter, that the ink and other things would be thawed out by the time the students got there at 8 to 8:30 in the morning. The bell would ring outside or from the tower of the school building to let the community know that school would begin in half an hour. Welcome to the shop area of the museum. This shows quite a number of different things, some of the different small industries that were taking place quite a long time ago. The tin shop, the woodworking shop, the blacksmith shop, and even some exhibits about different deliveries that were made to the stores. With as we walk down here, we see an old tank truck that used to deliver the fuel to small stores out in the countryside. Most of the tank was filled with kerosene for lamps. The next probably was filled with white gas for the gas stoves. And the third smallest one was filled with ordinary gasoline. Because at that time we didn't use, that was before cars began to be in the countryside. This wagon delivered fuel oil for over 45 years to the different communities of the area. It's kind of interesting. We do have next to it a cutter too that was used to get around. One of the old gas pumps that was in a filling station way back in the 1920s and 30s. They would fill up the gasoline and then they would pay for the amount of gallons that it went down. And of course gasoline was 5-6 gallons for $1 at that time. In the shop exhibit area itself, we've got a drive shaft that from a gasoline engine that runs quite a bit of the equipment in here. Sometimes we have it on. We have several tools from turning lathes to sheet metal pipe makers, a woodworking shop, and a drill press, and some of the other tools that were quite common in the shops where they made things by hand back 50, 75, and 100 years ago. As we walk down through this, we see even an old telephone booth that was taken out of one of the, in fact, out of St. Croix Falls. We don't have the old telephone in there because we haven't found one yet. This was used from 1906 to about 1935 in St. Croix Falls for people that didn't have their own telephone. So they could go into a telephone booth. The door isn't on it because we are still repairing that. It's double lined, 2 wood oak shelves or walls with airspace between them so you could talk in there without being hurt. Then we have things from the old gasoline car days, oil pumps, license plates, parts, and all the different things that were part of the early cars when they first came around. So just a few things about the shop. As we walk out here, we go by a model of an old dairy barn, and of course quite a few things are hanging there pretty much like it was. Even the hay fork part is being installed up there. And this is the leather harness area. And this was 2 of the vices that were used when they repaired harnesses because the harnesses would break many times. They'd have to sew them together, and these are 2 harness vices, both of them in good shape, and we put a couple of saddles on there. This one happens to have a side saddle, the kind that the ladies would wear, because they would have to sit on one side of the horse. They couldn't straddle the horse in those days when they first rode the horses. Okay, the old jail building was torn down in the back here of the museum grounds, and so we just resurrected and kind of made a jail out of this old vault. This vault was part of, only access to it was through a spiral stairway going upstairs, and that spiral stairway is still there. Then we were able to acquire the jail door that you go in first, and then the oldest county jail door that we have is in this door here, and then we have a few pieces of the metal equipment from the old jail. It was pretty simple, didn't have much of anything in here. The food is very simple too. We even have a part of an old liquor still that was confiscated by the Sheriff's Department on display in this particular area. This would have been the Sheriff's office, and it was the Sheriff's desk. This is the toy room, and our youngsters from 2 to 100 like this room because it reminds them of some of the toys they've used. We got quite an extensive collection of dolls, and they're being categorized now. There's probably 300 different dolls here. Some of them real old and some of them more recent. But dolls are a very important part of all of the young girls' life as they were growing up as a child. Then we move on down this way just a little bit. We see some of the old toy chinaware and different things that were used by girls as they would play. And of course we've got some bows and arrows there that the boys would use too. And over the corner here we got a wooden wheel wagon that's quite unique because it's about 100 years old now, and a wooden wheel wagon that was used as a special toy. They either could have a goat or dog pull it, or they could pull it themselves with that handle that's up there. And then of course we've got some other things, even a doll trunk over here, but quite a number of things, some of them that some of you were quite familiar with, Lincoln logs and tinker toys and some of those things. Some of those are older, but we remember them as youngsters. And some of the toy cars, other things, including some of the BB guns that the boys would have had as a special gift. Over on this side, we've got an authentic old buggy that dates back about 130 years ago, and we put it in behind glass so that we couldn't touch it. It has its original parts to it, and it still works just fine. And then of course we've got skates, and, skis and other things that were used during the winter time when things got cold, but quite a few of these different things along the way. So this is the just a little bit of the toy room, and one of the things that people like to do is to turn the train on. It's good to have you here in part of the farm exhibit. Agriculture was the biggest industry in Polk County for the first 125 years. Now the other things have come in to kind of supersede that one, or take the place of but we still have about 275 dairy farms. We're still farming about the same amount of land, and we're still milking about the same number of cows. Dairy farming was a primary industry here because there was a chance to grow more forage for dairy cows and more feed for feeding the dairy cow. And of course, there were over 35 milk plants here in the county. And of course, they would separate the cream from the milk and make butter and sell butter. A few of them made cheese, and they would sell that all around. In fact, the cooperative dairies, when there were a number of them here in the county, there were I think 16 of them, became a part of what was one of Land O'Lakes, the international firm of Land O'Lakes, because that is a combination of all these small cooperative milk plants around the country. Some of the equipment, of course, there's everything from a corn sheller to various dairy pieces of equipment that we use for putting in butter and slicing it up into 1-pound lots, milking machines and cream separators, different kinds of them here, milk, cream, butter churns, and even the parts for an early milk separator up here, a cabinet that was taken out of one of the stores here, and then we've got several of the crock butter churns, and they're of course a collector's item now. People use them for many things, but and then we have some of the old wooden bowls that they would use to mix the butter up after they had made it. And then these are some of the milk cans that were used to bring the milk to the dairy plants. Here we've got a little machine that used to incubate eggs so they could have chickens. Baby chick would be born in about 3 weeks after it was put into one of these incubators. And hatched out, break its shell, and come on out and give a chirp. And they'd take them out of this and sell them to the farmers to raise. Or they would do this, bring them out into one of their small brooder coops out on the farm where they were hatched out. This is one that was a home one. And then this is a feed mill to grind feed for the livestock. Kind of an interesting one that was used many years to grind up the grain so that the cows could eat it better. Then we do have in the other room many things that are interesting history in the agricultural area. This just happens to list the farms that are over 100 years old that have been in the family for over 100 years, and there are still quite a few of those around. Then we move on down, and of course one of the farmers discovered that he had a lot of clay underneath his farmland, so he made brick for a while. And in fact, there were 2 brickyards here in Polk County that made out of clay. They would put them in forms and heat them in ovens to make clay and make brick out of it. And many of the buildings in Polk County were made from the brick from these 2 yards. The Domrook yard at St. Croix Falls and the one south of Osceola. Here in this room we've got a couple machines called fanning mills that used to clean the seed grain, and every farm had one of those to get rid of the weed seeds in the grain so they wouldn't be seeding weeds when they planted their small grain. Their oats, their barley, and their wheat, and their rye would be planted sometime during the year. And then we have some more. We have even a hand planter for corn and one that would plant 2 rows. And some more small fanning mills and a vegetable chopper, which was part of what they would chop up to give to livestock, particularly hogs, when they had some extra root crops and they wanted to chop it up so it would be a little easier to eat. An ox yoke here that was part of what, when they used birds animals, particularly the large male cow, the cow family would be used as oxen to pull things because they were cheaper to get than horses. And they weren't as reliable, but they were one of the beasts of burden that was very common back in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. Here we have the what was typical of a family kitchen. We even put in a summer kitchen here because this was typical of what many of the farm families had, because it got too warm to cook in the kitchen when they would fire with wood in the stove. So it got too hot, so they would have one that was out in a shed nearby. So this shows in this one a regular typical kitchen. We put in a few extra pots and pans and things to show some of the things that were used the last 125 years in kitchens. Some of them are more recent. One of the things we have is an old icebox before they had refrigerators. We have a dry sink there that used to wash dishes and other things. And then we've got another one that was painted, because many of them got painted because they look kind of tough. They even have a butter churn in the kitchen too, because that was a common place for it. And of course the cook stove, we have one kind that has an oven door on both sides, and the more typical one with a warming oven above it to keep things warm if the workers on the farm came in late for their noon meal or their evening meal. Lots of different pieces of equipment, everything from coffee grinders to maybe even a bracket lamp in this kitchen. In a little more recent, we do have an old General Electric refrigerator that still runs. It was bought in 1927 and still in running order. It should have a new gasket on the door, but otherwise it's okay. And then we do have a small gas range from the 1940s and 50s that would have been used probably out in the summer kitchen, along with some of the crockware that was part of the making of everything from sauerkraut to jam and jellies during the summer months. This is an old post office desk that was found in almost every grocery store in the early days, because there were a few neighbors that would come in and pick up their mail. There was room for about 18 different post boxes here. Of course, they could put in larger packages over here. They would open the desk and have the name of the person there, and that was how they got their mail. They had to pick it up. There was no free delivery out in the mailboxes in those days. They had to go to the local corner store, wherever it was located, to get their mail. Post offices were later, more post offices were put into grocery stores, because there were at one time, I think, some over 60 post offices in Polk County. Now there are about 15. This is a hardware store kind of a thing, and this has been under construction now for the last few months. All the different things that were sold in the hardware store. We do have a hardware store sign here, a Berman's 1898. And the interesting part of it is that the two signs we have here advertising the hardware stores are both being phased out this last year, after having been in business for over 100 years. A lot of the equipment was, of course, sold here, everything from small farm equipment to tools of different kinds, and the hardware stores sold a lot, and they became more specialized because the grocery stores couldn't handle some of the bigger things that they needed to buy for their operation on farm or whatever they were doing. Over on this side we've got some washing machines of different vintages, a wooden one, a couple copper ones, and quite a few different kinds that you might find interesting as you walk through the hardware store area. We talked in the farm exhibit, we talked a little bit about Land Lakes as being a very important part of Polk County government and Polk County industry, especially the dairy industry. And these are just a few of the artifacts that we have on Land Lakes. There are a lot more things, but Polk County had a sire barn, and it later consolidated too with Land Lakes, beside the milk plants that sold their butter to Land Lakes to have it processed and sold on to other places. So Land Lakes was a very important part. Some of the founders of the Land Lakes program were from Polk County. And like we mentioned earlier, there were several milk plants that were part of that organization.